you. So we can put questions to everybody. There are some that have been submitted already, and one for Professor Paton, just to continue with the conversation, is that the first line of defense of anyone pro-lockdown is that there were millions of additional deaths in 2020, reinforcing that there really was a catastrophic pandemic. And you can't even start a discussion unless you examine the scale of the excess mortality. How did 2020 compare with prior years when adjusted for population? I think probably there are other people on the panel who'll have a view on this as well, and that's from Carla.
Yeah, I think there's probably other people better qualified than me to answer that, but I think excess mortality was high as far as I understand it in 2020. But you know, there have been years over the past 20 years when we have had very significant excess mortality. Of course, the really important thing, though, is to analyse whether the measures you have to deal with that, you know, there clearly was a serious pandemic, whether the measures you have to deal with that are effective, and secondly, are they effective enough to take account of the huge costs that they imposed?
I think probably there are some other people on the panel who could come in on that. KAROL, SIKORA, is that something you could comment on, do you think?
You know, from cancer point of view, yes, but you know, it's very difficult overall. And again, time will tell when you look back on it. So if you come back in 2025 and then you start looking at the impact on long-term diseases, stroke, cancer, heart disease and so on, you'll see the patterns emerge. But for all of those, it's going to take time. And then, of course, there's the quality of life factors, which are much more difficult to assess. So people waiting hip replacements and cataract operations, which are the two commonest operations performed, to try and sort out how much quality of life downtime there's been because of delays due to COVID, and because of the almost religious association of COVID and illness. I mean, COVID, you know, killing 82.5-year-old people has been put on a pedestal compared to every other health consuming illness, and it's the first time we've seen that really happen. I mean, it happens in triage in an emergency room. So you have a big crash and you've got 50 casualties. You have to sort out those that are the usual thing. Triage comes from having people you write off, basically, right at the beginning to save the ones you can save. And maybe we should have had a more triage approach to COVID, but that's sort of heresy in the NHS to suggest it. To say, let's keep cancer services going simply because if we don't, more people are going to die. And maybe the next time around, we can be better at it.
Thank you. Joanna Nuttles asked a question for Claire Craig, which is, the government states double jab or proof of immunity. What proof is there of community immunity, and what tests do you need to satisfy this demand?
So immunity is multifaceted, and the testing has all been focused on antibody levels, which does seem to be a fairly good measure of who has had a symptomatic disease, but it doesn't necessarily measure all the people who have some form of immunity, because there's the immunity that comes from just very basic things like the hairy cells that in your respiratory tract that get rid of all the mucus that stop anything getting in, as well as T cells and other complexity around immunity. So what we have failed to do is measure that broader immunity within the population. And when we have tried to measure T cell responses, we've seen high levels of immunity. But of course, when you're talking about vaccine passes and things, that's all being ignored. And only vaccination is being counted as being a valid type of immunity, even though we know that natural immunity provides stronger protection and probably longer protection too.
Thank you. And now in the room, I'm just looking for hands up. Quite a few. I'll go to the one I can see immediately in front of me. You, sir.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the panel to maybe indulge in a bit of crime scene investigation, if I will. Because let's not beat around the bush. All of these interventions have been completely bonkers and self-destructive, and it's a waste of time pretending otherwise. So my question is, why has this come about? Now, you've all worked in various different fields, the NHS, psychology, business, economics. Claire, you've borne the brunt of the abuse from what we could call the pro-lockdown side. And if I could say so, you've dealt with that heroically. So in some ways, you know how they think. So my question broadly to the panel is, what were the currents in society that were swirling about in the last 20 years or so that made this happen? As Nick quite eloquently put at the beginning, why the rule book was thrown out.
I think there are 5 cognitive factors that meant leadership went wrong. Groupthink, illusion of control, sunk cost, bias for action, and confirmation bias. And I think in most countries, the leadership suffered from all 5 of those, and they have caused a lot of the bad decisions. That's it. Groupthink, the illusion of control, sunk cost, fallacy, bias for action, and confirmation bias.
Wow, sounds like that could do with a little bit of expanding on.
Well, the second one I think is the most important, the illusion of control. The experts and the government have made out from the beginning, they know what they're doing, and they know how to deal with it. And I think we can all agree neither of those have been true, largely.
Yeah, it's very true.
Can I also just add to that? I think that there's, over the last sort of 20 or 30 years maybe, I think that within the population generally, I think there's a real move towards risk aversion as well. So I think that we were in a climate anyway where everyone's primed to be frightened and primed to seek the support or protection of the state. I think, from what I've seen.
I think it comes down to the precautionary principle, doesn't it, which we're seeing applied more and more widely. And there's really nothing that you can't justify on the grounds that something might happen. If we're going to live our lives on the grounds something might happen, where does it end? It's a very worrying concept that seems to have got a grip on society. Where's the next question? There, the lady in the right. I apologise, I can't see everybody because the light's shining in my eyes, so apologies. Alex, I couldn't see you for a moment there when you asked your question, so apologies if I...
Does Oxford, Imperial and the BBC have a hidden agenda? And if they do, what is it?
Who knows?
Well, can I give that a go?
Go for it, yeah.
I've tried to steer people away from the idea of a devilish plan by people in a smoke-filled room, and also away from the idea that there's an agenda, and rather towards the idea that there are bad, dominant ideologies. And that links into what Luke was saying earlier. There's a current in thought, particularly at these supranational organizations, that goes along the lines of posing all the time centralist solutions that involve social engineering. And I think that we need to really examine that a lot more carefully because it's taking over our world. That's where you get these ideas of cancel culture and of censorship. It's the attempt to impose a social engineering vision on the world. And it's very, very dangerous. It's not the first time in history that this has happened, and it always ends in disaster. So for me, I think it's wise to step back from the conspiracy-type thinking or the agenda-type thinking and to really consider the ideological setting.
Also, Hanlon's razor, I think, says something like, never attribute to deliberate malice incompetence.
Yeah.
Can I address that as well?
Please do.
I think certainly amongst a large majority of academics involved in this, and incidentally, of course, academics have been the ones most vociferously pushing for lockdowns, and they're the ones who have absolutely no skin in the game. They don't suffer a single day's loss of earnings from this. It's actually very comfortable for them to be in lockdown, many of them. And right from the beginning, when I was on panels discussing this, there was almost a consensus from the other side that the lockdowns were generally beneficial in terms of the whole climate crisis narrative. They were actually saying things like, this would be great if we could continue this. You know, CO2 emissions have dropped since this lockdowns first began, and we need to have more of this. Okay, and I think that you cannot dismiss that. I mean, basically, what I'm saying is, I think that we're heading. This is just the precursor for climate lockdowns, and that's always been a very, very serious drive amongst a very large class of academics.
Well, next question. Alan, I can see you.
Well, fantastic presentations, and I'm always daunted by being the dumbest person in the room. And I suppose that's my question, really, because there's so many great brains here, and people have been doing so much work in their respective areas. And I suppose there's a couple of questions and thoughts I've got, which is, I often hear people that disagree with lockdowns and are furious with what's going on, calling people sheeple and stupid. It's a similar thing to when we perhaps are called COVID-idiots or all of that kind of thing. And my question is, how do you think that we can engage in an upbeat way with, and what do you think perhaps outside your specific areas as well as specifically within it, in a way that can really appeal to the public? I know we don't have the same platforms, and often we're not invited on there, but that would be my question. And I am concerned somewhat that sometimes some people end up saying, well, all those stupid people who just keep following everything, and it actually means perhaps we need to be more convincing and compelling in the calls for freedom and liberty and in our respective areas. So I wonder what you think about that.
Who would like to take that one?
I'll have a start, if you like.
David, please do. Yeah.
I mean, although my talk was about the effectiveness of lockdowns, and we can try and get that message over, that's very hard in the context of the huge, propaganda of wave of fear that the government has deliberately put in place, and we've heard about before. Actually, I think the most important thing is to go back to first principles and remind people of their basic rights and freedoms. And I'm a little bit more optimistic on that point of view. I think people do respond. You give them an opinion poll and they say, oh, yes, we need to lock down and so on. But actually, you dig deeper into what they think and how effective these things are. I think they're much more cynical and sceptical of government. So to some extent, I think we're pushing it a bit of an open door in challenging government, the way the government's gone. But really, the focus should be on the rights and wrongs of this, whether long-term use of criminal law to criminalise everyday normal behaviour and activity is the right way to deal with a health crisis. And we have to persuade people that that's not the way to deal with a health crisis. But I think we can do that by focusing on people's basic rights and freedoms.
And the other thing I would say is, I think the most resonant area that, gets people's emotions going is the damage to children. Mm. Yeah. And the very effective small group, Us for Them, I think made a significant difference to government policy in this country in getting schools back open. And that was basically 3 women. Mm. And firstly, obviously they were right, morally and every otherwise, health-wise. Mm. And I think the government realised they were wrong. But I think the damage to children, the other side don't have an argument. Mm. Yeah. And so I think if you're going to use one strand, you focus on that. You marshal your facts and you just push that, because I think it has the most impact.
I think it was Nick Hudson said earlier that the World Health Organization has mentioned children many, many times in its communications, many more times than they're actually impacted by the disease itself. And I think it's quite indicative that the other side, who are pushing for lockdowns, do talk so much about children when actually children are so little affected.
Yeah, but we have to point out the harms being done.
Yeah, it shows that they're worried about that argument.
Well, I think it's been quite, sorry to say, it's been quite difficult, I think, because of the because of the control that media have had over this, because I think that's something that surprised me. I thought, like I said, when I was talking before, is that when all this started, I thought, my goodness, we're going to have to wait for terrible stories to come out, because that will be what changes people. I thought we'd have a baby P or something, and the awful things that will have happened and have happened. In the first 3 weeks of lockdown in March, there were 14 deaths of women. And there were 2 children that died for domestic violence. And that's over double the amount of what normally happens in that period. And I think that it was, in that year, I mean, it was extraordinary numbers. And I thought that sort of information would make people think. And it doesn't seem to have made as much impact as it should have done. And I think a big part of that is it's not been given enough precedence by press. And I think there's a big responsibility that media carries for this.
I completely agree with that. And I think the share of voice for the people questioning what's happening has been ridiculously low, and that's something I hope will change over the coming year. But there's no doubt the reason, partly, why people are so accepting of what seem very, very onerous restrictions is that the media has helped to educate them to be accepting and not to question. There's a question over there. Somebody's hand's been up quite often, but I can't see you because of the light, but if the microphone can go there.
Hi, I'm Ross Jones. I'm a retired paediatrician from Hart. And I have to say, I want to pick up what Zenobia and Luke have just said about children, but I'm just so shocked that I'm still on Hart, because I only said I'd do it until they got a proper non-retired paediatrician. And I'm still the only mainstream consultant paediatrician in Hart. And I don't know where my colleagues are. And I would say, every speaker has said something relevant. Claire's talk about asymptomatic transmission. That has been the focus of closing schools. The thing about isolating healthy contacts. Again, if you're an adult who gets pinged, an adult who's positive, that pings an average of 5 other people. And yet for school, 1 child is positive, 150 go home. And that is seeming to me, and all the damage, the health damage to their mental health, their physical health, and their education. And at the end of it all, what is it for? Is it for priming parents to want to have their children vaccinated? And at the moment, 70% of parents seem to want to have their children vaccinated, and yet we all know, everybody in this room knows, that children are not impacted by COVID. So how a society is even considering vaccinating children with a vaccine that we know has short-term harms? And last week in the BMJ, there was a for and against delaying, and it was really reassuring to see actually Andrew Pollard, chairman of the JCVI and lead investigator for AstraZeneca, saying that we should delay because we think that risks to children from the vaccine might outweigh risks of harm. And the only comment coming back in has said, oh, but we do vaccinate for protection of adults, like we vaccinate dogs for rabies to protect humans. So we're saying, and that's the only response, that we're saying as a society, that children are less important than dogs. And what are we as a group? What are we going to do to change the narrative? And that's my question to everybody. I don't know the answer.
Like a religious meeting.
Zenobia, that sounds like one for you, but...
About changing the narrative?
Well, maybe not that far, but I was thinking more the first part. But I think maybe we can just all agree that changing the narrative is very much what we all, I think, would like to be doing. Question there. Yeah. The microphone will come to you if you... there you are.
Thank you. Very much in line with what's just been said and the issue of children. It seems to me that children's lives won't get back to normal at all. We can scrap bubbles, we can urge schools to stay open, but until we stop testing children routinely, their lives are always going to be different to the lives of adults who are not subjected to this routine testing procedure. So it's kind of 2 questions, really. I mean, how do we stop this mad testing of children? But I was wondering also for Claire, specifically, do you have any breakdown of the data when we look at the statistics that are coming out at the moment that show how many people we are testing? What proportion of that is actually under 18s who are being subjected to routine testing at schools?
So I don't have that figure on the top of off the top of my head, but the testing issue has to come to a head, because the way that we're testing will produce cases in the vaccinated as much as the unvaccinated. Now, if you want to prove that your vaccines are working, you can't keep doing it that way. It doesn't work. And you can already sense that it's starting to fall apart, where you see studies where they have to completely change the criteria for a positive in order to say that the vaccines worked. And likewise, with schools testing, we thankfully saw a reduction. So there was a real enthusiasm, it seemed, to start with among the parents, but it wasn't maintained, and it has fallen off since then. There's also lots of testing going on in universities as well, actually. There's a lot of people in their 20s that get tested. And what we find is that they're doing these LFT tests. They have a really quite a low false positive rate, but there are false positives. And they were only recently started checking those against PCR testing. They use the fact that the percentage of children and people in their 20s is higher to claim they're driving the epidemic. But of course, those people were selected with the LFT testing. So of course their percentage positive is higher, because that's why they were tested. But I think we really have to get through to the parents. Parents have to start realizing that they need to stop testing their children for it to end. And I do feel like the penny is slowly dropping, that people's patience is wearing thin, and they're seeing the impact that it's having on other people's children when they do it. So I think we might get there with parents, but it has to come from the parents. They have to stop consenting to it.
I think there's also... Sorry. I think there's also important psychological factors, I think, that maybe you were hinting at as well about testing of children. It's yet another measure, isn't it, that's giving a really, really unhelpful message to children about the fact that they are to be feared, that they might be contagious, that they might be putting people at risk, and also just the whole process of medically testing healthy people is just, it used to be called Munchausen's by proxy, didn't it? So, I mean, it's just really weird that we're thinking this is okay. I mean, the thing that gives me hope is that most adolescents can't get in the shower, let alone stick a swab up their nose or whatever it is. So I think that I'm not surprised that it's dropping off. But it would be nice if, parents were on board with that, and we're not encouraging it.
Just to add, the epidemic of isolation, I think, really is bringing it home to parents over the past few weeks. But let's not forget, these tests are not free. The amount of resources the government has put into the whole test and trace, mass school testing, it's eye-watering. We're talking billions and billions of pounds. And of course, this is money which should have been spent on cutting down cancer waiting lists and everything else that's been neglected countrywide. And at some point, that's going to come to a head too. And we have to face reality. And I think that perhaps will help end the disaster of the mass testing.
Sunk cost for you?
Towards the back, yes. There, if we can bring the microphone. There we are.
Hello. Yeah, hi. My name's AJ. I'm a football coach for teenagers, also a father of teenagers. A lot of work I do is with children and teenagers, and it's been terrible to see what's happened to a lot of them over the last 16 to 18 months. What I've also seen as a former military man is a lot of very, very poor leadership across so many sectors across the whole country, and obviously education being the one at the minute. So we all know it's far easier to just say, no, send the whole class home, and then actually stand up and actually, grow a set and say, well, actually, let's actually investigate where this kid was, what they've done, to test them again, etc., etc. Like some schools do. But I'm quite lucky. Our school has actually been very good through this. But there's a lot of schools around the country that will happily just send a whole year home with no questions asked. How do we sort of get the message to the people higher up in the education sector that are pushing these rules or restrictions and policies down to all the sort of schools? Because we all know if there was a real huge, scary pandemic, every single rule and restriction and policy would be the same across every single school in England, Wales and Scotland, because obviously we're all on the same island. How do we get the message, or as a collective, to these people who are high up in these different sectors that just happily isolate people and turn the blind eye rather than actually stand up for what's right?
I think, Zenobia, that's probably one for you, if that's all right.
I mean, it's been a complete lack of leadership, isn't it, in the Department of Education? Because I think that, you know, as they've done, we've seen them do this with business this week with the mask mandate that's not a mandate. You know, they've done exactly the same with education, haven't they, where they've just put it onto schools. And then schools then, I feel sorry for head teachers. I feel really sorry for them. They're there trying to deal with all of these different issues and the pressures from parents who feel different things and so on. I think it's really, really difficult for them. And you highlight things like, there's all sorts of the MPIs that are in place, but that you're talking about sport and so on, and the things that have been, the activities that have been interfered with. Many schools only just, or some haven't yet started their extracurricular activities and all of that. But I think it has to come from the Department of Education, doesn't it? I think it's really hard to, in what is still, we're all told that we're still in the middle of a public health crisis. I don't think we can really expect head teachers or people at local levels to take responsibility for those decisions. So I think my view is it's complete failure of government. I can't really see what people on local levels can do other. I mean, it frustrates me too. In my schools, my children are now back in masks again. They're not supposed to be, but they are. But I feel sorry for the heads. I don't think they know what they should be doing either. I don't know whether...
I wonder, I mean, this is partly a UK-focused question, but Nick, I mean, what do you see happening educationally internationally? Is this something that's happening in other countries?
Yeah, I was just about to say, actually, that the failure of government argument's a good one, but the question we need to ask is, why did all governments all over the world fail in precisely the same terrible way at the same time? So I think there's got to be a deeper answer. Yes, in South Africa, we've had exactly the same thing. 2 years of education lost for just, countless children. We don't have the capacity to do online schooling for any but a small fraction of our school population. So it's been an absolute crying shame and disaster. But I look at the extent to which, again, central authorities have got too much power. We need to decentralize as much as possible. It's not okay that a captured organization like the World Health Organization can, in effect, de facto, if not de jure, write the rules for how we're going to play the game of healthcare all over the world. That has to end. And I can't see it ending by way of conventional means, because, as somebody pointed out earlier, we do not, as dissident voices, have a place at the media table. So we're going to have to box very smart, and I don't think this thing is over anytime soon. It's a multi-year battle to shift the balance away from these frankly ludicrous policies.
Mm. And one thing I noticed, we're talking a lot about children in schools, but the impact on students in higher education has also been horrendous, I think. To be a student over the last year has been horrific, and I know there have been a lot of problems and mental health issues there. When we're talking about policies not being standardized and not taking young people into account, I don't think we should forget that students have had a terrible time too.
It's worse than that. There's something wrong with the values of a society when they start imposing restrictions and basically punishments on children for the sake of reducing what is in essence a fairly low risk for elderly people. We've gotten our ethics upside down when that is happening.
Yeah. Question there. Yes. I can't see you very well but yes, it's you. If we can get the microphone.
Hi, I want to ask about urgency. I've got a 34-year-old woman in my network who is paralyzed after 2 Pfizer shots and fighting for her life right now. So I think we need to up the urgency on all of this. I think by far the single most damaging effect of lockdowns is the reduction in in-person social interaction between young and healthy people. As Nick pointed out earlier, we keep our natural immunity strong when we have constant interaction with others and lots of others, but social interaction is even more important for feeling emotionally supported and for the exchange of information. It's in-person debate in a social setting, in a meritocratic setting, i.e. outside of your workplace or school, where you have no fear of being judged by those above you in the food chain, where we learn and grow and evolve. The human mind, the collective consciousness is dependent on this. This harmful policy of isolating people, isolating children, isolating the elderly, isolating the next potential great minds in humanity is damaging human progress. This is systemic, sociopathic strategy. It is essential that we rehumanize society and encourage in-person interaction immediately, not just to stop lockdowns ever happen again, but get a massive push towards socializing children again, socializing young people, supporting the small businesses that typically host such interactions, get healthy, bright individuals mixing again. We need strong, positive action to push this urgently. We have to take the focus off the sick and put it on the healthy, focus on the things that keep healthy people well and thriving. We can comfort the sick, care for the sick, but we must not penalize the healthy. We need an empathetic response, not a sociopathic one. More interaction, not less. We need a focused, strategic push for the exact opposite of lockdowns. We have to figure out how to capture that message, put it out there. It's clear that our established authorities are not going to do this. We, the general public, have to do it. We have to coordinate it, not live in the delusion that we're somehow going to persuade authorities to legislate to do it. They're not going to. No one is coming to save us. This feels like a total institutional and moral collapse. If we go through another winter of this, the demise of humanity could be irreversible. If we want to survive, we have to fight back with a totally reversed narrative. I think we need more urgency. Thank you.
Yeah. That's very passionate. I'm not exactly sure what the question was, but I'll take a question.
That was a very good answer.
Yes.
Hi there. Following up from what the lady said, I also have a friend, fit and healthy in her late 20s, who had the Pfizer shot and ended up in hospital. This was a few days ago. She literally messaged me on Instagram to tell me about this. But my question was, it's mainly for Zenobia, a lot of anecdotal evidence, a lot of evidence from A&E consultants, from the London ambulance services, shows there has been a noticeable increase in reports of suicide. In the United States, there was a hospital which reported a year's worth of suicide attempts in a month. And in Portsmouth, there was a consultant who said there was a huge increase in children coming in as young as 10 years old, self-harming. London Ambulance Service reported a doubling in suicide attempts, and that's not even including people falling from heights or drug overdoses. And yet, the government, people like Nadine Dorris, they're constantly saying, oh, suicide hasn't gone up. We know there's been loads of individual cases. So a few years ago, the Home Office was exposed fiddling the crime statistics to water them down to make it look like it wasn't bad as it was. Do you think that the authorities are fiddling the books on suicide to minimize the obvious impact?
I would say they're not clever enough. But you're right. I've been puzzled by exactly your observations. You read these snippets about London Ambulance Service, more in a month than in a year from previous years and so on, but you don't see the data. The data look good, as though there's no increase. So I really don't know.
I agree. I mean, I think that with suicide statistics, they're complicated anyway. I mean, we're told, aren't we, that there hasn't been in the ONS data saying that there hasn't been a rise, and this is what Nadine Dorries says, but, you know, anecdotally, you hear different things. And certainly there's been rises, you know, from Freedom of Information reports in you know, overdose and self-harm presentations in hospitals. I know in Manchester, where I am, I think there was 22% rise in last year of young people and children coming through for urgent care for those reasons, and about 19% nationally, I think, from what I've heard. I think with suicide statistics, the other thing is that it takes a while for them to kind of makes sense, as it were, because actually the overall number may not necessarily reflect what's going on in particular demographics or in particular regional areas. So I think it's a kind of longer story to see that. But I absolutely, it would make sense that, you know, that we should have a huge amount of concern and awareness of that and ask those questions, given that we know that young people and people generally are presenting. Anecdotally, I'm hearing from colleagues about older adults presenting with self-harm and with suicide attempts as well. So yeah, I don't know whether, I wouldn't say that there's any fiddling going on, I don't know that, but all I would suggest that we need to wait and see. I think it's a picture that will present. And as I was saying, you know, I was talking earlier that we've got, you know, and you know, one of the other speakers was saying that too, we know for a fact that economic recession is really strongly associated with suicide, really strongly associated with enormous emotional distress, particularly for men, middle-aged men. So, you know, we need to be watchful about this. We need to be really careful as we go into a period of, you know, furlough ending and all of this stuff happening.
Thank you. We've got time for 2 last questions, and there's a forest of hands. So I'll take you over there and you there in the front. So quick questions if possible.
Julie, thank you. David Livermore, University of East Anglia. Question to your good self, Nick. Do you think lockdown has in any way fed through to the recent bouts of civil disorder in South Africa, or do you think these are entirely separate phenomena arising from the malfeasance of the Zuma regime?
Yeah, we discussed this a lot. Of course, the media is trying very hard to portray it as entirely owing to the Zuma story, but that's not in any way a credible analysis. We went into lockdown as one of the least equal societies in the world. And lockdown has driven inequality like no other social strategy, and that's everywhere in the world. It's made the rich richer and the poor a great deal poorer. So going in with one of the greatest inequality measures in the world, then you lock down, you can understand that the levels of desperation, the levels of frustration are through the roof. And yes, it may well have been the case that the Zuma incarceration was the spark that lit the tinder. But there's absolutely no question that the degree of social instability that lockdowns have engendered is a far greater portion of the problem here.
Thank you. And one last.
Tony Hinton, surgeon. It's just something a bit more positive about kids, really. When my child went back to her 6th form this year, she was the only child in the year not doing testing, because I wrote to the headmaster and explained the nonsense about it. I think now, in her class, in her whole 6th form, almost no kids are doing the testing. Every parent I get the chance to speak to, I speak to them and explain. And I ask them to explain to other parents. We need to change this from the bottom. There's no point trying to convince someone at the top of the Department of Education. That's a waste of time. But you can have a lot just by speaking to other parents, your friends, get them to speak to other people, and we have to start making the change for ourselves.
That's a great point. We will do one last question, though, to finish on a question. Is there one more question just before? So one last chance. You there. You've been trying a lot, I think.
Thank you. My name is Mike Dodd. I'll ask you a question which I'd like a bit of help with now, and then just give you a little bit of information on myself. This is a great event because I see it pushing things slightly more mainstream. Part of the issue is so many disparate groups have come up over the last year or so. You know, I've set up something.
If we can make it a quick question, please.
Well, I think it's important because we've obviously got a lot of political parties, Reform, UK, Heritage Party, Lawrence Fox, everything else. So people need to come together, which the gentleman said down here, we've got to do it for ourselves. So getting over to the mainstream is really, really important because there's no point just converting to the church, which is already converted. One of my roles is
I need a quick question. Sorry, we're running out of time.
Yeah, okay. I'm the chairman of the CAA, which is the Children's Activities Association. We represent 40,000 businesses. They are activity providers for children across the UK. Before the lockdowns, there was 2.5 million activities for children every week. So 2.5 million children. That's been decimated. Now, I've got a board meeting, the first board meeting where we meet in person next week in London. I've got all the board members coming down. You obviously know where my mind is, but I've got to be very, very level-headed. So how do I and how do we get that information out to the mainstream for my board colleagues? Because I can't, I don't believe in anything what's going on. I just say, go back, get the kids to school, etc., etc. So I guess my question is how do we come together and how do we get the great information we have here and get it to people like my board, where I can put it across to my board to say, right, here are the facts, here are the facts, here are the facts, because that's what we need to do.
I think the answer to that question is actually one that we will all answer in different ways. But my answer is very simple, is that we just keep trying. Because actually, this is very difficult. There is not a magic bullet which solves getting the information to the people who need it. It is just hard work. Every single one of us, like Tony Hinton was talking about just now, doing what we can through the mechanisms that we have, through the people that we know, through the media that we can access to get the word out. And eventually, keeping the lights on in terms of getting the message out there will work. But it's slow, hard work when the balance of the media voice is against you. Let me throw that to the panel. Is there anybody else who'd like to comment on that?
No, it's the long haul, and you just be persistent. Ultimately in life, it generally pays. So don't give up, keep going. We will win, because the truth, Yeah, we will win.
Could I just come in there on one point?
Yeah.
A trap on both sides of the argument, I think, has been to go too utilitarian in all the thinking. I even did it today talking about the cost-benefit analysis story and the absence of a cost-benefit analysis. I think we've got to shift the language, and the one person in the audience spoke quite eloquently about just doing just that. We need to start marketing agency, spiritedness, character, virtue, values, and stop talking about the positives and negatives in the utilitarian calculus. We need to shift that language and market a different language. There's a kind of moment of cultural weakness that has gotten us to this point, and that's the fight, is to take that cultural weakness on.
Here. And that's a very, very powerful note to end on. I'd just like to say thank you to all the panel. And everyone who's spoken for a superb session that I found very informative, very powerful,